port in Oman was burning, and at almost the same moment, people in Washington were talking about a 95% drop in Iranian missile launches, as if that number proved Iran was running out of options. That is the wrong number to focus on. The real story is not that Iran is firing less. The real story is that Iran may be entering the most dangerous phase of the war, the phase where it stops using volume to prove it can hit and starts withholding the most consequential tools until the exact moment they hurt the most. That is what makes this moment frightening. Because if you listen carefully to the argument coming out of Washington, it still sounds like a familiar script. The United States and Israel have hit thousands of targets, launchers have been destroyed, missile salvos are smaller, therefore Iran must be degrading toward exhaustion, therefore more pressure now might finally produce the break. But the source material for that optimistic reading is much weaker than it looks. The interview this piece is built from makes a very different argument. It says, yes, Iran has undeniably lost launchers. Yes, damage has been severe. Yes, Tehran has been hit hard, hospitals and schools have been destroyed, and parts of the country have taken punishing blows, but the drop in launch volume does not automatically mean collapse. It may mean selection, it may mean calibration, it may mean that the side under pressure has stopped firing to demonstrate quantity and started firing only when the warhead. The targets and the timing all line up. That distinction changes everything, because if the missiles still being used are the most accurate and the most destructive ones, then the lower number is not comforting. It is a signal that the war may be moving from saturation to precision. And if that is true, then the war is not calming down. It is becoming more deliberate. I want to use a framework for this because without a framework, all of these individual claims just float around as separate talking points. The framework is reserve logic. Reserve logic means a state under heavy pressure does not spend its last serious options just to satisfy television narratives about momentum. It preserves them for threshold moments. It studies battle damage. It watches what its enemy is threatening next. It holds back the tools that can change the shape of the war until the other side crosses a line that justifies using them. That is the argument here. Not that Iran is comfortable, not that Iran is winning in some simple sense, but that Iran may be preserving escalation options because it believes the war is now approaching a decision point. Look at the clues one by one. First, the interview rejects the idea that Iran's missile capability has been dramatically degraded in the way American officials imply. Why? Because each time people start talking about dramatic degradation, Iran responds by launching a smaller number of very heavy, very accurate missiles that devastate what they hit. That is not what a force on the edge of disappearance looks like. That is what a force looks like when it is becoming choosier about where it spends its most valuable inventory. Second, the argument is that the early salvos did a job that Western coverage often ignores. They were not just attacks, they were depletion operations. They forced Israel, Gulf states, and naval assets at sea to burn through interceptor stocks. If that reading is right, then the first stage of the war was partly about draining the shield so that later strikes could hit harder with fewer launches. Again, fewer missiles in the air would not mean less danger. It would mean more efficiency. Third, the interview emphasizes that Iran is using drone footage and satellite imagery to study battle damage in real time. That matters because it suggests the current phase is not random punishment. It is target optimization. A side that is collapsing does not usually behave like that. A side that still expects to shape the next phase does. And fourth, the most important clue of all, the interview explicitly raises the possibility that Iran is waiting to see whether the United States is foolish enough to strike Kharg Island or move toward a ground campaign. That is the threshold point. That is the place where reserve logic becomes visible. If Kharg is hit, the argument is that Iran could respond not with more of the same, but with a qualitatively larger escalation against Gulf oil infrastructure, shipping lanes, desalination plants, and the wider energy system that keeps the region functioning. In other words, the lower launch count today may not be the sign of a war winding down. It may be the sign of a country keeping powder dry for the moment. It decides the war has become existential. Now, once you see that, the rest of the picture looks very different because the next question is not whether Iran is holding back. The next question is what Washington can actually do about that. And here, the source material becomes even more brutal. There are really only a few paths in front of the United States, and none of them are clean. One path is the off. Trump can declare victory, say the nuclear program was damaged, say the launchers were reduced, say the enemy was punished, and try to turn the page without admitting that the maximal objectives were never achieved. Politically, that is the most attractive path because it avoids the nightmare of a larger war. Militarily, it is probably the most rational path because the alternatives are so ugly. But the problem with the off-ramp is that it does not restore the old order if Iran has withstood this much punishment without bowing, then any settlement after that endurance is likely to look less like American domination and more like a negotiated retreat from ambitions Washington can no longer enforce. That is what makes the off-ramp so difficult. It might stop the bleeding, but it also risks making the endurance of Iran the central political fact of the war. The second path is air and naval pressure without a ground invasion. Keep bombing, keep blockading, keep threatening, keep telling the world that more pressure will eventually break the regime. The interview tears this logic apart. It says relying exclusively on air and naval power for enduring strategic outcomes is absurd because we have seen this movie too many times. Air power can destroy. Naval power can threaten. Neither can by itself build a stable political end state inside a country like Iran. All they can do is increase damage while narrowing the menu of acceptable exits. That is not strategy. That is momentum without destination. The third path is boots on the ground, and this is where the interview becomes almost scathing. The answer given is flat. No, absolutely not. Not because it would be morally troubling, though. It would be not because it would be expensive, though. It would be, but because the United States does not have the boots, does not have the right force structure, and does not have the operational environment needed to make such a campaign work. Think about the argument in plain terms. The American army today is much smaller than the force that assembled for the Gulf War. The Marines are lighter. The terrain in and around Iran is brutal. Modern surveillance means any slow buildup of ships, equipment, and troops would be visible early. Persistent surveillance means the enemy would know where you are, what harbor you chose, what route you were building out, and what to hit before your force. Even got out of the gate, drones, missiles, and precision strikes would make the old-style ponderous buildup extraordinarily vulnerable. This is not 1991. That line matters because a lot of public conversation still acts as if America can always choose to scale up the same way it once did. But if a large buildup can be watched continuously and targeted early, then ground war stops being a matter of political will alone. It becomes a matter of whether you can survive the assembly of the force itself, and the argument here is that maybe you cannot. Then there's the fourth path, which is the most dangerous because it often hides inside the others. Strike harder at the economic foundations of Iranian power and wait for Iran to answer at the regional level. This is where the source returns to desalination plants, oil depots, Gulf infrastructure, and the Strait of Hormuz. Those are not side targets. They are the system. The Gulf is not just a map full of ports and terminals. It is a tightly linked architecture of energy exports, shipping insurance, desalinated water, storage, refining, and political trust. Hit enough of it or frighten it enough. And the damage is not local. It spreads through electricity prices, food production, fertilizer markets, industrial costs, shipping schedules, and currency volatility. That is why this war is bigger than the missile count. People keep looking at launch volume as if the key question is how many more salvos Iran can fire. But the deeper question is what kind of system. Level damage Iran is still preserving the ability to trigger if it decides the war has crossed into a phase where restraint no longer serves it. That is the terrifying part, because the source material is not describing a state that has no options left. It is describing a state that may be refusing to spend its last real options too early. And that means the war as danger is no longer measured mainly by what has already happened. It is measured by what has not happened yet. There's another layer here that matters. The headline is not the real story. The deeper story is always in the structure underneath the event. The headline says Iran is launching fewer missiles. The deeper story is that fewer missiles may be the visual surface of a reserve strategy designed for the war settlement phase. That settlement phase is already visible. Listen to the interview carefully and you hear the outline of it. Iran is saying it will not live with the status quo. It will not accept an existential threat from Israel. It will not accept Gulf arrangements that allow hostile military power to be staged against it indefinitely. It wants something larger than survival in this round. It wants to alter the post-war architecture of the Gulf. That is why the conversation eventually turns toward a treaty arrangement for the Strait of Hormuz, guaranteed not by America alone, but by a wider group that could include China, Russia, India, Japan, Korea, and the United States. In other words, the interview is already thinking beyond the current strikes and counterstrikes. It is thinking about the order that follows them. And that is exactly why reserve logic matters so much. If Iran believes the post-war order is now being negotiated through endurance, then holding back is not passivity. It is bargaining power. You do not spend your most frightening tools before the bargaining phase has matured. You wait. You force the other side to ask itself what happens if Kharg is hit, if the Gulf S oil infrastructure burns for years, if desalination plants become targets, if shipping remains insecure, if allies conclude that Washington cannot protect them. if the price shock spreads, if the political demand becomes not restore deterrence, but simply find any exit. Then suddenly the drop in missile launches looks very different. It looks less like weakness and more like a message: we are not done, we are deciding. And that is why this moment is more dangerous than many people want to admit, because wars become most unstable not only when one side is collapsing, but when one side is absorbing punishment, preserving key options, and waiting for the other side to make one more bad decision. That is what this source is really warning about. Not that Iran is untouched, not that Iran is invincible, not that America has suffered some simple defeat already. The warning is more precise than that. The warning is that the war may be entering the phase where lower visible intensity hides higher structural danger. That is the phase when policymakers start talking themselves into one more strike, one more threat, one more show of resolve, because the enemy looks quieter than before. And then they discovered quiet was not exhaustion, it was preparation. So if you want to know the most important thing to watch next, it is not the raw launch count on your screen. It is the threshold question. Does Washington attack the economic and strategic nodes that Tehran has implicitly marked as escalation triggers? Does it move toward a ground option it cannot properly sustain? Does it keep treating air and naval punishment as a substitute for strategy? Or does it take the off-ramp before the reserve logic turns into full release? Because if the answer is no, if Washington keeps pushing while reading restraint as weakness, then the next phase of this war may not be larger in volume. It may be smaller in volume and much worse in consequence, and that is the sentence I would leave you with. The terrifying part is not that Iran has done everything it can. The terrifying part is that it may still be choosing not to.